I happen to believe, and I'm getting on a bit now, sad to say, but I happen to believe there is still a reasonable chance that I will see United Ireland in my lifetime because I think things are moving in that direction at a greater pace. The key issue for me isn't really the political forms of that. For me, the key issue is which class unites the country.
May 3rd marked the controversial centenary of the Government of Ireland Act. For Republicans, it partitioned Ireland, keeping 6 counties of Britain's first colony colonized. For Unionists, it created the Northern Ireland Assembly and the basis for the union of the north of Ireland with the United Kingdom. However, recent developments may well mean that the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will not be here for long. Social unrest broke out in the north of Ireland as Boris Johnson's botched Brexit deal created a hard border between the north and the rest of the United Kingdom. His assurance that it would never happen simply turned out to be more of the bluster and lies for which he has by now acquired a deserved reputation. Arlene Foster, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party who had believed Johnson, has since been forced to resign. The candidates lining up to succeed her will almost certainly move the DUP further to the right, and the DUP's social base has been, in any case, already defecting to the even more reactionary traditional unionist voice. These developments can only endanger the delicate Good Friday Agreement that has just about managed to keep the peace since 1998. What exactly has sparked the unrest? Can the Good Friday Agreement survive? Will Boris Johnson go down in history as the Prime Minister who broke the Union? What are the realities on the ground today in the north of Ireland? What might Irish unity look like? This is Radhika Desai for the Real News Network, and I am joined today to discuss all these things by Mick Burke. Mick is an economist and political advisor. He has written extensively on Irish politics, particularly on the political economy of Irish unity. His writings have appeared in major outlets, including the Guardian newspaper, the Irish New Left Review, Soundings, and Socialist Economic Bulletin. He's currently researching James Connolly's socialism. Welcome, Mick. It's a treat to have you here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Let's start with the immediate context and then we'll delve a little deeper into the issues. So, to begin with, then, the Good Friday Agreement brought to an end 30 years of strife, known as the Troubles. The agreement is not yet 25 years old, and social unrest is once again rocking the North. What sparked it, and how does it compare to the Troubles?
Well, it's nothing like the Troubles as yet, because unfortunately, people in the north of Ireland are somewhat used to rioting on the streets, unfortunately, although the turn of events recently has been more widespread than normal. I think really what's going on is exactly as your introduction suggested. It's all the fallout, or it's largely caused by the fallout from the botched Brexit arrangements. And exactly as you suggested, what Boris Johnson did was he told the unionist population of the North that there would be no border in the Irish Sea, as it's called. That's really the compromise arising from the Brexit arrangements, because Britain insisted that it wouldn't have the same regulatory and customs arrangements as the EU. It could have had a Brexit with those, and that would have obviated any need for any type of customs border. But the hardliners of the Tory party decided that that wasn't for them. They were going to take the consequences, which they probably knew, in relation to hurting trade. But at the same time, they promised the unionists that they wouldn't have a border, customs border between Britain and the north of Ireland. They broke that promise because what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol, which places those customs borders between Ireland and Britain, was agreed between the British government and the EU and signed by Boris Johnson's government. So this is something he promised wouldn't happen, told his unionists, sometime allies, that it would never happen, then implemented it, agreed it, and then has campaigned against it vigorously since. And that's encouraged, I think, a large section of the unionist population to try to get the Northern Ireland Protocol ripped up. And that's caused the rioting that we've seen and the political turmoil.
So, in the dominant interpretation, one sees a certain number of other explanations, like it had to do with some funeral that the Republicans attended, or that it has to do with social deprivation, etc. And I guess if you can reflect a little bit on that, what is the veracity of those interpretations, and also exactly who is rioting and where and for what reason?
Okay. Yeah, the explanation that it was caused by Republican attendance at the funeral of Bobby Storey, a long-time and stalwart Republican, which did, it has to be accepted, break the lockdown rules. There's no question of that. But that was the cause of the rioting is nonsense. That happened 6 months ago. There was no rioting in the immediate wake of that. And really, it's just trying to shift the focus. That's a very persistent theme, really, in relation to British media coverage and British government claims about what's going on in Ireland, because they always try to remove themselves as real actors in the drama. In fact, they're the principal actor in the drama because they are the force still in Ireland. There are still British troops on the streets of part of Ireland. So there's always an attempt to shift the focus, shift the blame. The rioting was overwhelmingly in what are called loyalist areas. That's loyal to the British Crown. And as I say, it came 6 months after Bobby Storey's funeral. It had nothing to do with that. What really is the case is that, as we've discussed, the Brexit arrangements are wholly unacceptable to unionism. And I think it's worth discussing why, but they're wholly unacceptable. Boris Johnson told it wouldn't happen, and it did happen. And now he's telling them that he can rip it up. So they want to rip it up. And because they're not getting anywhere, they resort to rioting. And that type of political turmoil was also what led really directly to the ousting of Arlene Foster as the leader of the DUP.
Right. So then what I'm hearing from you is that it's really anxiety about Brexit and what it means for the loyalists or for the unionists, as they're also called. So, and you said it's really worth reflecting on. What does it mean for them? How do they interpret it, and where do you think they're going, basically?
Well, your question previously implied, I think correctly, that there is social deprivation amongst both communities, um, unionist and nationalist in the north of Ireland. But to be honest, that's a constant factor, and a constant factor can't explain a change. And the actual position is that unionism has at its foundation a supremacist ideology. It's a empire loyal colonial settler ideology, if you like, despite the fact that the unionists have been in Ireland hundreds of years. The ideology they have is that, and they're extremely frightened that somehow and at some point they will lose the backing which they need because they're a minority in Ireland from the British government. That the British government will somehow abandon them. I think they're right to fear that because the British government only operates in its own interests. So yes, I think they're right to fear that at some point. But if you have a supremacist ideology and you're a minority in the whole of Ireland, and now what's been revealed over successive elections, you're becoming a minority even within the Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland was established to ensure you had a majority. It was an artificial entity. That's an extremely worrying position. So the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Brexit arrangements, which essentially give a different settlement to the north of Ireland than to Britain in relation to both the EU and especially one component of it, which is the Republic of Ireland. that is extremely worrying to any supremacist based on, we're exactly the same as Britain. That's what really underlies all this.
And that's interesting because of course the loyalists are a minority in the larger Ireland, but they were a majority in the north, and that's why it was carved out the way it was carved out. That was the justification. So let's go on to the next question. The current social unrest appears at a time when many had started speaking of a sort of composite Northern Irish identity emerging. How has the divide between unionists and Republicans evolved since the Good Friday Agreement? And how is it if at all implicated in the renewal of social unrest?
Well, those are really interesting questions. It was quite remarkable, actually, because with Arlene Foster's resignation speech, um, which was perhaps the most progressive thing she ever said, she pointed out to her own party she's quitting her party, which is quite extraordinary. You've been the leader of it, and then you're quitting because you don't like its direction. She pointed out that there are people within the North of Ireland who regard themselves as Irish, there are people who regard themselves as British, and there are people who regard themselves as Northern Irish. And then she could have gone on to say there are people for whom that part of their identity is not uppermost at all. She even mentioned, which I think in Ireland is quite common in Ireland, they talk about the immigrant population as the new Irish, which I think is a wonderful phrase. Should be widely adopted in every country, I think. Um, that new Irish section of the population, I think, is a product directly of the Good Friday Agreement, i.e., the social conflict, the political conflict, and the conflict on the streets, all reduced by an enormous amount because of the Good Friday Agreement. And that left people freer to decide where they wanted to be in what was really a digital choice previously, nationalist or unionist. Um, and the growth of the Northern Irish identity, I think, is actually a part of the breakup of unionism. Now, it may well be that people from a nationalist background, some of them are describe themselves as Northern Irish. That's absolutely fine. But what it means is that the people who insist, i.e., the unionist community, that the state, which was created around them, as you alluded to, it's not Ulster. 3 counties of Ulster were kept out of it because they couldn't guarantee a majority. It was what its first leader called establishing a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people, and it implemented laws that favoured the Protestant community. All of that has been changed quite fundamentally by the Good Friday Agreement. So identities start to dissolve a bit, and I think it hasn't obviated the need to address the question of the legacy of partition. But what it does mean is people can do so in a calmer way than before, when the supremacists were completely in charge.
I have a couple more questions about the immediate context, and then we'll dig a little deeper. So, my next question is, how exactly has Brexit changed it? If you can just lay out exactly how Brexit changed it from the point of view of the three main jurisdictions, that is, London, Belfast, and Dublin. Exactly what has been changed by the situation created by Johnson's essentially hard Brexit and his total carelessness about the Good Friday Agreement. I mean, one could even go so far as to say that Theresa May failed to achieve agreement because she wasn't willing to give up on the union. And Johnson has simply thrown caution about the union to the winds and said, we're just going to have the Brexit we want, no, and I don't care what happens to Northern Ireland. So if you can elaborate on what the kind of Brexit occurred means for the three jurisdictions.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, going back to fundamentals, in a as a general proposition, the all the participants in a single trade area benefit from the size of the trade area. It allows for a greater division of labour or socialisation of production, whichever you care to call it, and is a net benefit in average terms. It's a question about how that benefit is distributed, for the entire population. Almost alone in the world, Britain has embarked on having a trade arrangement which puts up barriers. For the last 50, 60 years, all new trade arrangements in the world were about reducing trade barriers. And so the first thing to say is that the Brexit outcome is negative for everyone. It's negative for people in Britain. It's negative for people in the Republic of Ireland. It's negative for people in the north of Ireland. But it's especially negative for people in the north of Ireland for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the customs border running between Ireland as a whole and Britain as a whole, Britain being outside the EU and Ireland remaining in. That's interrupted trade, specifically to the north of Ireland. So there have actually been some shortages in the shops. It's disrupted to that extent. But at the level of the economy, for example, things like the agri-food business, which is one of the biggest sectors in Ireland, especially in regards to employment, is very integrated. It's almost as if the border doesn't exist in Ireland, because raw produce travels across the border, it gets partly processed, it travels back again across the border to get processed again or finished, and then it gets shipped from somewhere else. It's really very integrated. The problem is that the trade between Ireland and Britain now has a customs border between it. And Britain is experiencing big difficulties with trade with continental Europe, but Ireland as a whole is experiencing very big difficulties in trade with Britain and with continental Europe. So that's the first thing. The second thing is politically, it was in the Good Friday Agreement, it states that there can be no constitutional change to the status quo without the agreement of all the parties. Now, clearly, to some extent, Brexit is a change to the status quo. It wasn't the Britain and Ireland were both part of the EU when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Britain withdrawing from it undermines the Good Friday Agreement to that extent. And now that the British government seems intent on ripping up the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is what it says it will anyway, and the Unionists, again, for their own reasons, take the British government at its word, then that's going to be a further disruption. So this wholly undermines the basis of the Good Friday Agreement.
So it has already been violated.
Yes, it is. And the British government, it seems, is intent on a course which effectively undermines the Good Friday Agreement, even perhaps fatally, because it's essentially, as Boris Johnson many years ago said, he wanted to have his cake and eat it. He wants access to the EU markets without adopting its rules. Well, that can't happen. And in the case of the relations with the North, he doesn't want a customs border, but he does want differing arrangements between the two. So it's that problem that he has caused, and unfortunately the unionists have bought into his false promises.
And this brings me to my fourth question about the immediate context. I mean, clearly, I mean, one wonders, I mean, people wonder what accounts for Johnson's recklessness towards Northern Ireland. And I'm just speaking from the unionist perspective. Like, if you are a unionist, and after all, his party is called the Conservative and Unionist Party, it is committed to unionism, and yet he has behaved in a way as to totally endanger the union, and so on. So if you could reflect on what accounts for this recklessness, and particularly perhaps go into, it seems to me, one could argue that it is really a broader crisis of conservatism itself, which has brought things to this point, because Conservative Party came to the point where it could no longer win elections without making such reckless promises.
Well, it's interesting. It's because you're taking a long-term strategic view, and I don't really disagree with it. But we're speaking the day after completely disastrous elections for Labour, and with the Tories sweeping the board. So people might sort of scratch their heads and say, well, how could they be talking about a crisis of conservatism? And I think really the answer, or squaring that circle, is that in response to the crisis of conservatism, conservatism has remade itself. Essentially, it had an outgrowth, something that spun off from it and attracted a whole series of new forces in the what became then the UKIP and then the Brexit Party. It's reabsorbed those forces, and the primary element of those socially were the enraged petty bourgeoisie, who've suffered an enormous series of blows during the economic crisis that began in 2008. You know, there was very large scale unemployment in Britain, nothing like Western Europe as a result of the crisis, but the small businesses were decimated. I mean, literally, about a tenth of them went, they disappeared altogether. And instead, there's been the huge growth of fake self-employment in Britain, where the average self-employed person in this country gets paid a pitiful 10,000 a year, compared to the average wage of an employee of 26,000 a year. So there's a huge disparity. They've lost their firms and they've become very impoverished, and they're extremely angry, or they fear that this could happen to them and are extremely angry. So that accounts for Brexit, it accounts for the Brexit Party, accounted for UKIP. The Tories have reabsorbed that political force and have remade themselves. So they're much more like a party rather than of Theresa May and David Cameron and so on, John Major, none of whom were progressive, of course. But they've remade themselves more like the party of Enoch Powell, who was actually expelled from the Tory party and landed up in the north of Ireland as a unionist MP. So they've changed their character in order to come to terms with the crisis. But that character is an English nationalist one. So it's leading to centrifugal forces for the British state. And of course, once you introduce that force into the political mix, the most likely to break off is traditionally is the north of Ireland. But you also see some similar tensions in Scotland, which are now quite well established. And I think the emergence of other tendencies like that within Wales, leave aside the geographical stuff in Britain, which is very varied. So that's what's happening to the Tory party. And in relation to what they're trying to achieve in Ireland is that type of English nationalist political outcome, i.e., they will just bulldoze their way through to maintaining the union on reactionary terms. So they will ally with the unionists. They will undermine the Good Friday Agreement. They may even try to rip up the Good Friday Agreement. But it will be done on the basis of loyalty to the union and what they themselves called Empire 2.0.
Interesting. So yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, that we're speaking at a moment when labor is really exactly the deterioration of labor is about to become clear in the local elections and so on. So when I speak of the crisis of conservatism, I was really referring to the decisions, for example, first of all to promise and then to actually implement the referendum, and then the unfolding of events since. But of course, since the departure or since the departure of Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party has just been on a completely downward swing, and Keir Starmer has done nothing other than actually to perpetuate it, to exacerbate it, etc. Anyway, so that makes the situation more complex, and of course, at the moment, the Tories seem to be on the top of the world politically, and so on. But okay. That's very interesting. So really what we are looking at is a contest between, preserving the Good Friday Agreement, which seems to be more and more impossible given the political circumstances, and on the other hand, some sort of Irish unity. Some sort of Irish unity. So let's dig underneath that. So what made the Good Friday Agreement possible on the one hand, and what has made its workings difficult on the other? Because of course its working was never completely smooth. The government installment was rocked by various crises and so on. So if you could sort of reflect on the politics of the last less than 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these again are really quite fundamental questions that you pose. What brought about the Good Friday Agreement at one level was that there was a war going on. It was a war between an armed insurgency in the north of Ireland and the British state, and it was just dragging on and on and on. And they essentially fought each other to exhaustion. Um, um, but what it required politically, and I think it's a very interesting thing for progressives to understand and socialists to understand, is the international context. Because of course, if it was simply in any political struggle between Ireland and Britain, there could only be one winner because Britain is a much more powerful entity. But what actually happened was the international context changed. And it seems to me, if you look at the role of Bill Clinton and various other US leaders, Democrat and Republican, and see what Joe Biden is doing now. Joe Biden's doing some very unusual things. I wouldn't want to mistake it for progressive things, but when Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International were both very tied to the US state to one extent or another, call out things like Israeli apartheid, or when they say there's Armenian genocide, or when, very amusingly to some of us, when Joe Biden on the campaign stump was asked, he was literally asked, I can't remember the reporter's name. This is Joe Bloggs from the BBC. This is Joe Bloggs. Do you have a word for the BBC? And Joe Biden said, yes, I'm Irish. So I think that tells you something. That tells you, and I think in relation to Ireland, I think it's the settled view of the US establishment that they want this thorny issue dealt with. They want to stop Britain stop messing about, as they see it, and deal with a really quite serious issue, and are big supporters of the Good Friday Agreement for their own interests. That I think they want to tidy up, as they see it, areas of conflict in the world which don't at all present them with any opportunity to exercise hegemony. They want all this stuff taken out of the equation. So, in relation to what brought about the Good Friday Agreement, one of the key things was the ability of the Irish Republicans to mobilise that type of sentiment in America. They also did a really good job of mobilising a similar sentiment in the EU. Especially through their representation and their representatives in the European Parliament. And so what brought about the Good Friday Agreement was a combination of the domestic pressures and the international ones. And essentially, Britain had to accept that the old supremacist, effectively one-party state of unionist one-party state in the north of Ireland couldn't be maintained, that there had to be some type of peace settlement and a certain degree of greater equality and reduction in institutional discrimination against the nationalist population. Had to accept all of that. I have to say that only a fraction of what was agreed has actually even been implemented, even all these years later. But that's what they had to agree because of the relational forces domestically and internationally. And I think that's where Boris Johnson is going to have some difficulty with his English nationalist project for the north of Ireland, because the relation of forces as far as forces for unity in Ireland and forces supporting unionism and tearing up the Good Friday Agreement may look very attractive to Boris Johnson sitting in Westminster if he looks only as far as Belfast. If he looks as far as beyond Belfast and as far as Boston and Washington, what he'll find is that the relationship of forces is not an attractive one for him. There are major forces in the world that don't share this approach that the Good Friday Agreement is just an annoying piece of paper and can be ripped up. They don't share that at all. So he may kid himself that everything around the English nationalist project is easily doable because he's master of all he surveys in England, but that doesn't go beyond the borders of England, I think.
No, he's in serious danger of reducing the UK to England, basically, by losing bits as he goes along with his. And that is the situation that arises from the original crisis of conservatism. But yeah, okay. So, I want to, of course, bring our conversation to Sinn Féin, which is, of course, the main force among the Republicans or nationalists, as however you may want to call them, and which has, through its skilled diplomacy, as you rightly point out, on the one hand with the United States, on the other hand with the EU, made possible as well the Good Friday Agreement and so on. But before we go on to that, can you just reflect a little bit on what made the functioning of the Good Friday Agreement, at least the government of Northern Ireland under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, so difficult?
Um, there are many specific instances that's created severe difficulties. The unionists as a bloc, as a political bloc, I don't mean every unionist, are completely reactionary. So there were issues around abortion, there were issues around gay rights, there were issues around parts of the Good Friday Agreement that hadn't been implemented, like an Irish Language Act, which places the Irish language on equal footing with the English language in Ireland, and so on. I mean, there's so many; it's hard to remember them all. That the unionists opposed, and that because that's the type of. I mean, people should understand the unionist ideology includes a strange element of millennial religiosity, so that, for example, a key part of unionism, which is the Orange Order, refers to themselves as the Israelites, and some of them interpret that literally, i.e., that they are chosen people by God and so on. So that's what you're dealing with, and up until very recently, every leader of the North. It was called the Orange State because every leader was part of that Orange Order. That tells you something. So they caused a whole series of difficulties just by being completely intransigent on issues like that, which would run counter to the majority opinion in the north of Ireland, as well as the basic fundamental democratic rights. And then there was things like there was a ridiculous, scandal around which was corrupt, there was a supposedly green energy program, which basically meant you got subsidized for the more energy you used, more energy you burnt, in fact. And it was which was £400 million, which is, on the grand scheme of things, not enormous, but it's a big amount of money in the north of Ireland, given the budgets that we're talking about. And that was essentially people who were unionists, big unionist supporters, big farmers who benefited from that. I mean, literally cases of people building small barns where they could burn the material because the subsidies were outstripping the costs. So and that brought down the assembly. But underlying all those things is essentially a strong element of unionism, which is, as I repeat, supremacist ideology, which cannot bear power sharing with the people they are supposed to be superior to. If you can imagine asking, a political formation built around the reactionary whites in South Africa, or indeed in the southern United States, to power share with the black population, they're going to try to bring it down. And the test always was whether Britain would back them. Because if Britain would backs them, then they will give them an inch, they'll take a mile. If Britain is circumscribed by international factors, then they give up and they accept that the power sharing is the only game in town. But I was recently looking at many of the unionists now still talk about direct rule, which is direct rule from Westminster, i.e., they're so anti power sharing that they'd rather be ruled from somewhere else than have to work with Sinn Féin.
No, I think those are great analogies with the south of the United States or with South Africa, and of course, direct rule would mean simply turning the clock back to the days before the Good Friday Agreement. So essentially, what we're saying is that a combination of international pressure and the stalemate in Northern Ireland in the course of the Troubles essentially have put the Unionists in a very difficult position, what they would consider a very difficult position of having to share power with people they don't really want to share power with, they consider inferior, etc. So that means that their position has become untenable. Now, in this context, of course, there is a very, very important and big force that we should, in our final sort of question, turn to, which is Sinn Féin and the prospects of Irish unity. Now, Sinn Féin has been historically and is a progressive, left wing, kind of socialist party, as well as a party of Irish unity. They have never given up their struggle. After the Troubles, they have been conducting the same struggle in a peaceful fashion. And of course, the interesting thing is that Sinn Féin has been advancing in terms of its advancing electorally, both in the north of Ireland and in the Republic. So, that seems, at least on the surface, very promising for Irish unity. But can you sort of elaborate and comment on both the prospects of Irish unity and its relation to Sinn Féin and the advance of Sinn Féin?
Sure. I mean, I think you have to trace the modern advance of Sinn Féin and the Republicans back to the hunger strikes. I remember reading something I thought was really perceptive by Gerry Adams quite some time ago. And he said that politics in Ireland, the whole of Ireland, was never the same again after the hunger strikes.
Gerry Adams being the previous leader of Sinn Féin, yes.
Yes, yeah, the former president of Sinn Féin and long-time leader of the party, along with Martin McGuinness. And he made the point that, for example, just one example of this was that after the hunger strikes, which were a truly, epoch-making event, it wasn't just that simply 10 men gave up their lives, which was, extraordinary thing to do, but it was the political ramifications of that, which were just still reverberating now. And Gerry Adams made the point that after the hunger strikes, there was never a single party government in the South again. They always had to have coalition. Now, the post-partition settlement in the south of Ireland, in the Republic, which is what James Connolly called North and South, the Carnival of Reaction. That Carnival of Reaction took the form of two very right-wing parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, competing with each other to pretend that who was better on national issues or social issues and so on. And
always reactionary national and reactionary social issues.
Yes, exactly. And Tweedledum and Tweedledee, they just shared office. And they pretended that there were these massive divisions arising from the civil war in Ireland, which followed partition. And in fact, they were both products in different ways of the Carnival Reaction settlement, and supported it.
And embodied it. They were the reaction. Yeah.
They are basically they're what happens when you have a withdrawal by the empire, at least from part of the colony, but the empire is successful enough to organize a counter-revolution while they're doing it, and they're both products of that. That's really the case. So both reactionary parties, but they essentially have to now collaborate with each other to form governments because of the consequences of the hunger strikes initially and how Sinn Féin has built how Sinn Féin is built on that. And that really, I mean, it's not an even process. There's no such thing as a straight line progression for Sinn Féin support. There are lots of difficulties. There always are difficulties. But the essential thing is that's what happened, and they've built on it to one extent or another.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that particularly the so-called Irish miracle, which turned out to be based on a bubble, and which both parties cooperated in creating, has led over the last dozen odd years towards to great economic pain and so on. And this is the context in which Sinn Féin's progressive economic policies have attracted a wider social base and so on. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely right. Um, I'm a bit nerdy on this stuff because I've looked at it so closely. There was a period of about 8 years um, when the Irish authorities in the Republic took a good decision for once, which was when Britain was forced out of the exchange rate mechanism. That they devalued what was then the Irish punt, but stayed in the exchange rate mechanism, which was the precursor to the euro, with lots of stuff in between. And that was actually the first time that they'd ever broken, in fact, in the history of Ireland, they'd ever broken in any significant sense from British economic policy. And what happened was, for a period, there was a huge influx of genuine foreign direct investment, by which I mean people engaged in foreign direct investment who actually built stuff. You know, they built factories, they built processing plants, and so on, and created employment. What the well, there's a phrase in Ireland, the gombeen men. It means people who will sell you something they don't really own because they've taken it from someone else. That's the gombeen men who run Irish politics in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They deliberately misinterpreted that period for our future lies with kowtowing and abasing ourselves to foreign, usually US multinationals, and kept on cutting taxes. So there was no tax base when the crisis hit. The tax base was hardly existed, and that was really that the good period ran from essentially 93 to 2000, and from 2000 onwards it was the ridiculous Celtic Tiger stuff, and they ruined the economy, and they're still doing it. I mean, Ireland has a high per capita, very high per capita GDP, much higher than Britain, but the average living standard is barely higher than Britain. And the reason for that is so much of the value created in Ireland is robbed and doesn't find its way into Irish people's pockets because of the gombeen men.
Exactly, and because of the tax regime and so on. And so at the moment, what earlier you were referring to was the fact that these two parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, have created a coalition precisely to keep Sinn Féin out, which has otherwise, many would argue, has been the winner of the last election. So that's very interesting. So we should wrap up soon, and so I would say if you can just reflect on what this advance of Sinn Féin on both sides of the borders means for Irish unity, and what shape or form, what are the shapes and forms it might take that are visible today?
Okay, well, again, another very big question. Um, Sinn Féin is the only all-Irish party. It's the only one that actually organises across the border. Fianna Fáil, which actually in its title styles itself the Republican Party because of its history and tradition, is always threatening to organise in the north and never does. Because the first thing you're going to be asked, notwithstanding what we said previously, the first thing you are going to be asked by anyone in the north is, what's your attitude to the border? And then they're competing directly with Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin's long traditions of being present and delivering for the people that vote for it and so on. So they're the only all Ireland party, and on many measures they're actually the largest party therefore in Ireland. but their rise is really a direct function of the growth, or otherwise, or when it recedes somewhat, the growth of sentiment for Irish unity. Uh, they've added over time some really very detailed economic policies and so on, but it doesn't necessarily automatically flow that this is all going to happen in a straight line progression and everything's going to be fine. I happen to believe, and I'm getting on a bit now, sad to say, but I happen to believe there is still a reasonable chance that I will see United Ireland in my lifetime, because I think things are moving in that direction at a greater pace. The key issue for me isn't really the political forms of that, um, because people are already discussing, whether there might be a federal Ireland to reassure unionists, and I'm certain that people would have the view that you could carry on having a British identity in a new United Ireland. I would be astonished if that was not the outcome. And there's even an historic argument that um, there's no reason why unionists can't lead an Irish republic. Historically, many of the leaders of republicanism were themselves from a Protestant background. So there's those facts. For me, the key issue is which class unites the country, or which class alliances unite the country. Because if you see the effects, I'm in favour. I think it was a good thing, or an inevitable thing, shall we say, that Germany was reunited. But I think the reunification has been pretty disastrous for both parts of Germany, actually. And I'm pretty confident that neither part of Germany, east or west, grows as fast as it used to when they were separate, which is a pretty damning indictment of unity. Um, and that's because it was very much like a capitalist, management buyout. The West took over the East and closed its industries. They didn't want them competing. So nothing like that is going to lead to social or economic progress in Ireland. I think that the classes which lead unification must be, the working class, its allies, the small farmers, the small business people, and certainly not the people that owe their allegiance to the US multinationals and others that don't pay any taxes in Ireland. I think for me, that one way offers a very positive outcome. The other, I can't see that it's going to be. I'm in favour of United Ireland, of course, um, but I think it won't have as nearly as close or nearly as large beneficial outcome as is potentially the case.
Yeah, Mick, so far we've been concentrating on the attitudes and the interactions of the various political forces, but what about public opinion? Do you think that there is that support for Irish unity has been increasing on either or both sides of the border?
Yes, absolutely. The the support for Irish unification was quite small and quite a fringe idea up until the fairly recent past, last, well, maybe 10, 12 years. But like many other things, that was changed quite dramatically by the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement provides for Irish unification simply by a poll. Um, so once it became a possibility, then people have considered whether it's desirable. And the polls vary, but what the pattern of the polls is that you've never once seen a very large majority for unity, but you do see a very large support for it. So I'm talking about in the 40s%, um, and sometimes high 40s, i.e., sufficiently encouraging to those who favour Irish unity that you might actually win it in a poll during the course of a campaign, and sufficiently worrisome for those who oppose that outcome. Um, but it's definitely there. I saw a great little thing from a unionist. I think it was in one of the unionist newspapers, and he argued that what we were for and what we were against, and he enumerated them. We were against, a papist um, republic. We were for a British Empire, and so on and so on, have all disappeared. So our our antipathy to he questioned what the basis of their antipathy towards Irish unification was, especially as, of course, it you have this very negative outcome of Brexit, particularly for the north of Ireland. Things are not looking good economically over a long period for the north of Ireland. So the answer really is there's a big body of support for Irish unification without yet being majority, but sufficient to give hope to people who think that you could build a majority.
And this is also on both sides of the border.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the Republic, popular sentiment has nearly always been in favour of unification. One of the things, one of the parts of the Good Friday Agreement is that the Irish government had to remove from its constitution the claim over the North. But given that this was a dead letter, that wasn't such a big deal. But in terms of their outlook and perspective, the big majority of the population in the Republic are in favour. The biggest opponent of unification in the Republic are the leaderships of the political parties who were created by partition, and I'm sure will disappear if um, or reduced to irrelevance if the country is reunited.
And whereas in the north, there is a substantial majority in favor of unity.
Yeah, I would. When I was sorry, yeah, when I was referring earlier to the 40%, that's without ever being a big. That's in the north solely. There's always been a big majority in the Republic.
Well, that's again another very interesting analogy. And certainly, I would say that compared with the early 90s and the unification of Germany, capitalism is in an even worse state. So, its ability to ensure the prosperity of a united Ireland is at an even lower ebb. So, but I think that your point is very well taken, that it's the class basis of the unity that's going to matter. And so, perhaps on that note, for now, we should close this discussion. And I'm sure we'll be discussing this further as events unfold. As we speak, as you know, there is a election going on in Scotland. So the future of the United Kingdom is definitely getting more uncertain as we speak. And of course, the possibilities of the unification of Ireland, hopefully on the terms that you describe, are getting closer. So thanks so much, Mick. That was really very enlightening. And yeah, thank you very much.